trying to figure out why the price tag on everyday stuff seems to be constantly changing. It can feel like a real puzzle these days.
Yeah, it really can. The economic landscape just keeps shifting, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
Sure.
And the world of consumer goods, well, it's continually being reshaped by all these global events.
A really complex interplay, yeah.
Which brings us, right to today's focus, these new U.S. tariffs on consumer goods.
Yeah.
Ones that rolled out in 2025.
Big changes.
We spent a lot of time digging into recent market research reports, really trying to get under the skin of these changes. Our mission here, really, is to pull out the crucial insights from all that research. We want to understand the real-world impact, what these tariffs mean for the consumer goods industry, and maybe most importantly, what it all boils down to for you.
Exactly. We're trying to synthesize quite a range of market analysis here to get a clearer picture of what's unfolding.
Precisely. So in this deep dive, we're going to break down the specifics. What are these tariffs? We'll explore how they're affecting different parts of the consumer market.
Yeah, the subsectors.
Right.
Yeah.
And examine our reliance on key players like China.
A big factor there.
Definitely. We'll look at the pressures facing manufacturers and then talk about the strategies companies are, starting to use to navigate all this.
Yeah? Okay.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Where should we start? What are the main categories these new tariffs actually fall into?
Well, the research points pretty clearly to three significant areas. First, there's a substantial 25% tariff that's now applied to apparel and footwear imports.
25%. Wow.
Yeah. And it's hitting major production hubs, notably China and Vietnam.
Okay.
And this is really key because, the American Apparel and Footwear Association highlights this. A huge proportion of our wardrobes, think over 40% of clothing.
40%.
And even more for shoes, over 70% of footwear originates in China alone.
Those are really striking figures. So a 25% hike on that much of what we wear.
Yeah.
What's the immediate consequence?
Well, primarily it's forcing companies to reevaluate. They have to look at their established supply chains.
Can't rely on the old ways.
Not entirely, no. They're actively looking for alternative suppliers, maybe in other regions, and seriously considering nearshoring options, perhaps moving some production to Mexico, for instance. It makes you wonder if this focus on regional production might also spark some innovation in manufacturing tech in those areas, too. Maybe something that wasn't as urgent when relying on those established overseas giants.
That's an interesting side effect. But the main thing,
naturally, is these shifts can also lead to potential price increases for you, the consumer.
Right, that makes sense. Higher costs for businesses, they often, trickle down to us eventually. Okay, what's the second major tariff category you mentioned?
So the second big one is a 20% tariff on household appliances.
Appliances, okay.
Yeah, this covers your everyday essentials like washing machines, refrigerators, dishwashers, microwaves, especially those sourced from Asia.
So if your washing machine, finally gives up the ghost, you might be facing a significantly higher replacement cost. Is that the idea?
That's a very distinct possibility, yes. These tariffs, they affect both the wholesale and the retail prices of these appliances.
Right.
And beyond just price, they present real challenges for procurement teams, and they complicate managing just-in-time inventory.
That JIT system where they keep minimal stock.
Exactly. Companies keep very little stock on hand. They rely on frequent, predictable deliveries. Tariffs and the potential delays that come with them, well, they throw a wrench in that finely tuned system, a system lots of businesses use to keep costs down.
Got it. Okay, so we've got apparel, footwear, appliances. What's the third piece of this tariff puzzle?
The third category involves tariffs that range from 10% up to 15%, and these apply to a really wide array of packaged foods and beverages.
Food and drinks.
Oh, yeah. Everything from, your favorite snacks to canned goods, drinks.
Oh.
And the Consumer Brands Association, they've estimated a pretty significant potential impact here. They project a reduction in U.S. consumer purchasing power. Get this. Ranging from $90 billion up to $143 billion annually.
Whoa, 90 to 143 billion. That's a massive potential hit to our collective wallets.
It really is.
How does a tariff on something basic like, canned beans lead to that kind of broad economic impact?
It's the cumulative effect, really, across just a vast number of everyday items you buy.
Right, it all adds up.
Exactly. These tariffs, they can translate to higher prices at the grocery store, which in turn might lead you to adjust your spending habits, maybe cut back elsewhere.
Makes sense.
It also means food and beverage companies have to reconsider their supplier relationships, and in some cases, maybe even explore reformulating their products using different, perhaps cheaper or more available ingredients.
Reformulating, so the taste or ingredients might change.
It's possible. And that raises a crucial point, doesn't it, about potential shifts in quality, maybe even the nutritional content of some things we regularly buy.
So looking at the big picture then, it really seems these tariffs are just intensifying cost pressures everywhere, across the board, and pushing companies to fundamentally rethink their long-term strategies.
That's exactly right. And, the impact isn't uniform. It really varies depending on the specific consumer goods subsector, how reliant they happen to be on international imports.
Okay.
So with those broad categories in mind, maybe now is a good time to zoom in a bit, see how these tariffs are specifically playing out in different corners of the market.
Yeah, let's do that. All right, let's start with what we wear. You mentioned apparel and footwear getting hit hard. How are those industries coping specifically?
Well, like we said, this sector is particularly exposed just because of that significant reliance on manufacturing in Asia, especially China and Vietnam.
Right, the 25% tariff zone.
Exactly. So companies whose whole business models were built on that cost-effective overseas production, they're now really feeling the strain. Tighter profit margins. We're seeing reports mentioning brands like Skady and Lingua Franca directly experiencing this pressure.
So what are their options then? Can they just absorb these extra costs?
Not entirely, no. I mean, many are increasing their retail prices, trying to offset some of those higher import costs.
Passing it on.
Some of it, yeah. But they're also exploring more fundamental changes, too. Nearshoring production, say to Mexico, that's becoming a more appealing option for some.
Claro.
Right. Others are looking into on-demand manufacturing models, trying to mitigate the risks that come with holding large inventories that might get hit by tariffs or delays.
Good.
Even marketing budgets are getting scrutinized. Companies are trying to figure out how to maintain customer loyalty, even if prices have to go up a bit.
But isn't there a risk there? I mean, just raising prices, couldn't that lead to lower demand, especially for more price-sensitive shoppers? Are brands maybe thinking about absorbing some costs to keep their market share?
That's definitely part of the complex calculation they're making. It's a balancing act.
Okay. Sounds like a significant upheaval in that industry. What about home appliances again? You mentioned the 20% tariffs.
Yeah, so with 20% on both the fully assembled appliances and critical components sourced internationally, this sector is facing really substantial cost pressures.
Components too, okay.
Yes. So manufacturers and retailers who often operate on pretty narrow margins anyway, they're dealing with rising costs, longer lead times for getting the goods.
Right, the delays.
And just more complex inventory management overall.
Those longer lead times, that can be a real headache, can it?
Yeah.
Especially if your fridge suddenly dies.
Exactly. You need a new one now, not in 6 weeks.
Right.
So to adapt, some companies are considering bringing production back to the U.S., reshoring.
Reshoring, okay.
Or investing in assembly operations within North America. Leveraging existing free trade agreements with countries not subject to these tariffs is also being explored.
But that takes time, right, and money.
Huge amounts of both. These are significant strategic shifts. They require considerable time, major capital investments. So in the short term, it's probable that some of these increased costs will be passed on to you.
Okay, let's move into the kitchen pantry then. Packaged foods and beverages. How are they navigating those 10-15% tariffs?
Well, the pressure here might feel a bit less direct than, say, with apparel or appliances, but it's still significant.
How so?
Tariffs on imported consumables and ingredients, things like canned vegetables, frozen meals, even some components used in carbonated beverages, they're adding up.
Little bits everywhere.
Exactly. And this is prompting manufacturers to really examine their procurement contracts, reassess those supplier relationships they've had for years.
So we might actually start seeing changes in the ingredients lists. Or maybe even the packaging of our go-to snacks.
It's possible, yeah. Companies are actively looking for ways to trim costs. That could mean reformulating products with more locally sourced ingredients, if they can find them, or even optimizing packaging, maybe using lighter materials to lower shipping expenses. And the need to diversify their supply chains, reducing dependence on just a few foreign suppliers. That's also becoming increasingly critical for them, much more urgent now.
Okay. What about the stuff we use for personal care? Shampoos, soaps, cosmetics?
Yeah.
Are they feeling the impact too?
Absolutely. This sector is definitely experiencing pressure. It comes from increased costs on imported active ingredients.
Active ingredients.
Yeah, the stuff that makes the product work. Also, packaging materials like essential oils, specialty chemicals, even the glass used for bottles and jars.
So it's inputs again.
Right. Manufacturers are actively seeking local alternatives for these materials. They're exploring partnerships with regional suppliers. And they're also thinking about new product development strategies that rely less on imported components from the get-go.
Hmm.
And, this raises a potentially interesting point about maybe a push for innovation in sourcing and material science within the personal care industry itself.
So perhaps we'll see, I don't know, a greater emphasis on domestically sourced natural ingredients in our cosmetics down the line.
That's precisely the kind of shift we might start to observe. And one other thing the research mentions,
Yeah.
rising compliance costs and delays at customs due to new import classifications and checks. They're making it more challenging and just time-consuming to actually launch new personal care products into the market.
Another hurdle for innovation then.
Seems like it.
Okay, finally, let's touch on consumer electronics. You mentioned they got some temporary exemptions.
Yes, that's right. There have been some temporary exemptions granted in this category. However, the industry remains on, let's say, high alert,
Why is that?
mainly due to its incredibly complex multi-country supply chains. I mean, just think about a smartphone. Components can originate from numerous locations all across the globe.
Right, tiny parts from everywhere.
Exactly. So companies are proactively working to diversify their supplier networks anyway. They're building up buffer inventories to try and mitigate potential disruptions.
Hedging their bets?
Kinda, yeah. And exploring assembling products closer to their final markets. We're even hearing the term friendshoring being used more often.
French shoring.
Yeah, referring to the strategy of shifting production or sourcing to countries seen as, well, geopolitical allies, like India or Malaysia, for example.
That's interesting. Could that trend, lead to maybe new regional tech hubs popping up
Yeah.
and maybe less reliance on the traditional manufacturing giants?
It's certainly something to watch. Could reshape the global tech landscape over time.
It really sounds like every single sector is, well, scrambling to adapt in its own unique way. But there's this recurring theme, isn't there? This deep reliance on one particular nation, China.
That's absolutely correct. China has, for a long time now, served as the central pillar, really, of the U.S. consumer goods supply chain.
The numbers must be huge.
Oh, they are. In 2023 alone, the U.S. imported over $630 billion worth of consumer goods just from China.
Wow.
And that covers everything: clothing, footwear, toys, electronics, appliances, you name it.
And it's not just about the finished goods coming straight from China, is it? It's more complex than that.
Precisely. That's a crucial point. Even when you see a final product, maybe assembled in, say, Vietnam or Bangladesh,
Yeah.
many of the essential components inside the fabric for that shirt, the plastic casing for that toy, the electronic parts in our gadgets, they often still originate in Chinese factories.
Oh, okay. So the tentacles reach further.
Very much so. Consequently, these tariffs, hitting both direct and indirect imports from China, are creating this huge ripple effect throughout the entire supply chain.
That must be especially tough for certain types of goods.
Yeah, it's particularly problematic for seasonal goods. Things with rapid inventory turnover, like fashion items or holiday decorations. For those products, delays and increased costs can severely impact profitability, maybe even wipe it out.
So it's really not just a simple matter of finding a new assembly line somewhere else. It's potentially about reconstructing entire global supply networks.
That's the scale of the challenge for many companies, yes.
What kind of pressures does this put specifically on the manufacturers themselves, the companies making these goods?
Well, the pressures are considerable. They affect both their financial stability and their day-to-day operational efficiency. U.S. brands that depend heavily on Chinese manufacturers or even just material suppliers in China, they've seen a pretty significant surge in their input costs.
Input costs, materials and such.
Exactly. We're seeing reports of increases ranging from, say, 15% up to 30%, depending on the specific product category.
15 to 30%. That's a big hit.
It is. Apparel, toys, electronics seem particularly vulnerable, facing increased costs for essential materials like fabrics, molded plastic, packaging, and those embedded electronics we keep mentioning.
And the timing of all this must be particularly challenging, right? for an industry that often works on seasonal peaks and really tight production schedules.
Exactly. The consumer goods industry, it often operates with very strict production timelines and, relatively lean inventory levels to keep costs down.
Right, the JIT idea again.
Yeah. These tariffs, they've resulted in delays across the board, and it's especially noticeable for goods that have to meet specific safety or environmental regulations before they can be sold. Think children's toys or kitchen appliances. Extra checks mean extra time.
So moving manufacturing is an option, but not an easy one.
It's an option some are exploring, yes. Relocating manufacturing to alternative locations like India, Bangladesh, or maybe Turkey. But as you'd expect, this presents its own set of hurdles.
Like what?
Well, lengthy lead times just to get new operations set up, the absolutely critical need for thorough vetting of new vendors, you can't just pick anyone, and the reality of rising labor costs in many of those alternative regions, too. They're not always as cheap as they once were.
It really sounds like the larger corporations, the big household names, they might be better positioned to, weather this storm compared to smaller businesses.
That's a really crucial observation, I think. Smaller and mid-sized brands often just lack the same negotiating leverage with suppliers, or the deep financial resources their larger counterparts have.
Makes sense.
So they might struggle more to absorb increased logistics costs, or perhaps meet the higher minimum order quantities that new suppliers outside of China might demand.
Which forces them into tough spots.
Exactly. It can force them to make really difficult choices. Do they raise prices significantly? Do they offer a much narrower range of product options? Or, maybe worst of all, do they compromise on quality to save costs?
And any of those could hurt their brand, right? Damage that reputation and customer loyalty they've built up.
Absolutely. Which, raises another important point about potential market consolidation. Could these tariffs inadvertently create an environment where only the largest players, the ones with the deepest pockets and biggest scale, can effectively compete?
Meaning less choice for us, the consumers, in the long run.
That's a potential long-term outcome to consider, yes.
So, given all these challenges, how are the more established brands, the bigger players, attempting to navigate this? What kind of strategic responses are we actually starting to see emerge?
Well, the leading brands, many of them are undertaking significant overhauls of their global sourcing strategies. It's not just tweaking, it's restructuring.
Like what?
Like we touched on earlier, companies like Nike, IKEA, they're actively increasing their sourcing from countries like Vietnam, India, Indonesia, trying to spread the risk.
Diversifying away from China.
Yes. And nearshoring production to Mexico and Central America is also definitely gaining momentum. We're even seeing the development of more regional production hubs.
The regional hubs.
Yeah, the sort of in-market for market approach. Companies are aiming to produce goods closer to the markets where they'll be sold, trying to insulate themselves from those lengthy, tariff-vulnerable global supply chains.
That makes a lot of sense strategically. Try and produce closer to where you actually intend to sell the stuff.
Exactly.
What role is technology playing in all of this adaptation?
Oh, technology is becoming even more indispensable than it already was. Digital transformation is really accelerating.
Oh.
Companies are leveraging AI, for example, for more precise demand forecasting, trying to predict shifts better. And also using tech to automate their procurement processes, which helps them adapt more swiftly to, say, sudden fluctuations in input costs or availability.
Getting smarter and faster.
Trying to, yes. And there's pressure from the other end, too. Major retailers, think Target, Walmart, they're exerting more pressure back on their suppliers, demanding much greater transparency about cost structures and, crucially, the origins of the goods they're buying.
They want to know where it really comes from.
And how much the tariffs are impacting the cost, yes.
And it sounds like we, as consumers, might actually start to notice some changes in the products themselves on the shelves.
That's highly likely, yes. Product redesign and what's called SKU rationalization. Those are becoming pretty widespread practices now.
SKU rationalization, meaning fewer choices.
Essentially, yes. Companies are focusing on producing maybe a smaller number of items, but ones that have higher profit margins, or are simpler to source or assemble outside of those tariff-affected zones.
Focusing on the easier wins, maybe?
You could put it that way. Ultimately, the research suggests the companies that really emerge from this period in a strong position will be those that can effectively integrate data-driven insights.
Using that tech you mentioned.
Right. Combine that with real operational agility, being able to pivot quickly, and, crucially, cultivating strong strategic relationships with their key suppliers.
But it's about partnership, too.
Very much so. It's not just about reacting to tariffs anymore. It's about fundamentally reevaluating their entire go-to-market strategy for what looks like a new era of global trade.
Wow. So to kind of wrap things up then, it really sounds like these new tariffs are acting as a major catalyst, a catalyst for transformation within the whole consumer goods industry, impacting, well, everything from the price tags on our clothes and appliances
Yeah.
to the very ingredients found in our food and drinks.
That really is the core message from the research we looked at. These aren't just minor adjustments on the edges. They are driving significant, really fundamental shifts in how goods are manufactured, how they're transported, and ultimately, how they're sold to us.
And it seems essential then for both us as consumers and certainly for businesses to stay informed about these evolving dynamics as they continue to unfold.
Indeed. It's constantly changing. And, this prompts, I think, a pretty significant question for you, the listener, to think about.
Okay.
Consider the longer-term consequences of all this. What about the impact of these tariffs on innovation? Or on the sheer variety of consumer goods available to us? What kinds of trade-offs, between cost, origin, variety? What trade-offs might just become the new normal in the years ahead?
That's a really thought-provoking point to end on. What trade-offs become normal? What stood out most to you during this deep dive, and what further questions do these changes bring to mind for you? Thank you for joining us as we explore the impact of the new U.S. tariffs on consumer goods.